Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kocman, Director of Communications and Media for ABWE, here again as always with my good old friend, and your old friend too, Scott Dunford, who is pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California, and vice president of Bay Seed Collective, doing a lot of cool ministry things out there on the West Coast. Scott, as we dive into today's topic, our astute listeners will have already read the title of the episode and maybe know a little bit about what we're talking about here. We're talking about this question of how should believers respond, especially in the U.S., when foreigners come. Now, you know me, I have a little bit more of, let's just say, a vanilla background than you. You're the world traveler. You've done all the exciting things. You know all the things, right? I'm just this central Pennsylvania guy. That's just me. But even in my last neighborhood that I lived in, Scott, I met Turks, I met Gambians, I met Syrians. Those are just the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. And you are, of all people, you're living in a place where you're seeing that all the more true. And I hear that you have some very important house guests right now, too.
Yeah, certainly. If you're vanilla, maybe I'm butterscotch. I don't know how that would
Birds
work
of a feather.
But...
Okay, cool. We've established that. That's good.
Since we're just talking about pudding, I guess, or whatever.
These should be rapper names of ours, actually. That, you know,
Ooh,
vanilla,
like
butterscotch.
Yeah. Oh boy, we just lost half our listeners. But yeah, I mean, people who aren't familiar with the Bay Area probably don't realize just when people talk about diversity, we usually think of, you know, a smattering of people from other places, but, you know, living in a place here where literally most of my neighbors are not American citizens. I don't mean that lightly. My city probably is a majority Indian, and most of those have been here for 10 years or less, and the rest of them are Afghans. We have 30,000 Afghans in Fremont. We've got a large number of Sikh population. Technical way to say it is Sikh, but it sounds so sick to say Sikh that we changed it to Sikh.
I learned something. I thought the technical pronunciation was Sikh. I stand corrected.
It's Sikh. You know, and we could go on with different groups that are here. There's certainly challenges with that. You know, I mean, there's challenges culturally. There's challenges even linguistically. But there's also, from a mission standpoint, it's beautiful in that where at one point we had to raise well over $100,000 a year to go to a very restricted place to try to do ministry in a very narrow, difficult context. Here I'm in a place where the nations are on my doorstep and unreached people groups are surrounding me. They're my neighbors, they're in my school, and I shop with them, and sometimes they even wander into our church. You know, we've had a couple people that we would definitely put from unreached people groups that are attending our services, some that have gotten saved and baptized in our services, others that show up and they're not believers yet, but they're getting close. And that is part of the upside of what's happening in our world. And then something that ABWE has been a big part of, which I'm thankful that, and through roundabout ways we got involved with it, is this thing called the Afghan Initiative. And I'll let you talk about that a little bit more, but that's actually led to a family living in our home from Afghanistan. And it wasn't something that my wife and I planned to do. It's not something that we were like excited to do, to be honest. It's something that in some ways is blessings and inconveniences tied to that. But this is a believing family, someone who came to Christ in Afghanistan. Actually, they came to Christ in Pakistan, came back to Afghanistan, and because of, you know, current events and all that's happened in there, had to leave the country. And we get the privilege of hosting them. And as I get to know them, they're people of whom this world is not worthy. And to be able to have them in a place like this, to be able to live and do ministry and to impact this community with the gospel is just incredible. I want to talk about that a little bit more, but that's how it's impacting me right now.
I remember back in, I think it was May, I was at a conference and I was contacted and put in a group of meetings kind of out of the blue, as this all was just very much dumped on our plates suddenly within ABWE here at our headquarters, is that through connections with, we've got two ministry divisions that are involved here. Live Global is our partnership arm working directly with nationals in other countries, especially in places where we can't easily send a traditional sort of American missionary. And then Every Ethne is our ministry focused on the U.S. and Canada, churches in North America, helping them, especially helping churches not just plant and multiply and reach their communities, but reach cross-culturally within the borders of the U.S. and Canada as well. And so people from both of those ministries were collaborating, and somehow through this series of events, we were put in contact with maybe about a dozen families, just like those that are staying with you, just like your house guests, Scott. People who were believers, who were part of underground church networks in Afghanistan, but who were on the run from the Taliban, who had to flee for safety, and who ultimately were in the process of finding their way to the U.S., not just for political asylum. And this is something that I want to make clear, and we'll dive into it more as we talk. Whenever we talk about immigration, refugees, man, that's a lightning rod issue right now. But these weren't people who were only seeking political asylum or safety. Specifically, they're seeking to evangelize and reach other Afghan refugees, other Muslim background individuals who, like them, they've come to Christ, and they want to see others come to Christ as well, too. And so in a place like Fremont, that's incredibly exciting, right? There's 30,000 Afghans who are, 99% Muslim, right? If not 100%, 99.999, right? And to be able to reach them with the gospel, not just with the Dunford family and not just with all the other believers in a place like the Bay Area, but with people that know the culture, who know the language. And, for me, it brings to mind some things that I've been wrestling through personally, through devotions, sermon preparation, things like that. Let me set something up for you, Scott, and then maybe we can talk about it, because the Afghan initiative is just one of several initiatives of ministries, churches that are doing these sorts of things. If you want to learn more about the Afghan initiative, by the way, go to abwe.org/Afghan. But there's some incredibly cool things happening there. But let's backtrack. If you'll go with me on a journey, Scott.
Yeah, let's go on a journey, Alex.
All right, back into the time machine. Let's hop into the imagination station and let's transport ourselves to about 1000 BC. Okay, so this is kind of the zenith of the Israelite monarchy. Okay, so 400 or 500 years since the Exodus, about 400 or 500 years until the exile and until the Jews are dispersed. So this is Solomon building the temple, finishing the temple, his prayer of dedication. It's in Chronicles and in Kings, but it comes to us in the text that I've been working through in 1 Kings 8. And he's praying all sorts of things. It's a really significant redemptive historic moment. Okay, so he's praying that this meeting place between God and man would accomplish things redemptively, that people would come to God here, their prayers would be answered, they would come to know the Lord, and through that all the nations would know and fear Yahweh, essentially, is his prayer. So, it's bringing back this Edenic imagery, right? Like suddenly God is dwelling with man again, right? And we look back now as Christians and we know, man, that was just a taste of what was to come in Christ, because Christ is that ultimate nexus between heaven and earth, between God and man, where you come to Christ, you pray to Christ, you look to Christ, your prayers will be answered, you'll be accepted, you'll be received. And through our relationship with Christ, God is displaying his glory in Christ to all of the nations of the world, right? And so that's kind of what's happening. It's at this critical intersection point of so many different themes of Scripture. And here's the text. And I want to lay this out because it's not an immigration text. It's not a refugee text. It's indirectly a missions text, I would argue. But we can't read it through one of those lenses. We've got to read it through a biblical lens, through a Christian lens. Solomon is praying for the people, he's praying for the temple, he's praying for the nation, he's praying all these sorts of things. But then he shifts gears, which this is big. So he looks externally, outside the borders of Israel. He says, likewise, verse 41, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and of your outstretched arm. When he comes and prays toward this house, here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. And when I look at that, I see three things happening there that's exciting. I see two things that God is doing and then the result. The first two actions are implied, right? So this is not saying a proposition, God does X. That's not the way the verse is phrased, but in Solomon's prayer, it's implied that God is doing some things. And I think he answers Solomon's prayer. He hears Solomon's prayer clearly, because 2 chapters from then, you have the Queen of Sheba coming to Solomon and seeing the splendor of everything that's happening in Israel and learning something about Solomon's God through that encounter, right? You have the king of the king of Tyre as well is interacting with Solomon, right? So Clearly, God answers Solomon's prayer, and there's two actions of his and then one result. The first action is that God is displaying his glory actively to all the nations through what's happening in the temple, right? Because it says they will see and hear of your glory, your outstretched arm, all these things working in our favor, right? So God is actively shining his glory through the people, through his covenant people. That's number one. Number two, he's receiving those who come to him. So Solomon's praying. When they pray, when foreigners who don't know you, who aren't Jews, who aren't Israelites, when they call on you, looking to this place, recognizing that there is a God in Israel, then answer them. So God is receiving them. He's answering them. It's implied, yeah, he's going to be the God that answers prayer when you come to him through the right way, through the way that he's appointed, which for us is Christ, as we look back now, and we know that for sure. And then the result of that is described in verse 43, that all the peoples of the earth may know and fear your name. So knowing God, that's intimate. That's holistic knowledge of him. Fear your name, right? Which means fear. It doesn't mean just respect. It means fear. It means awe. It means a holy, reverent awe. You know, Isaiah 6, right? I am undone. Woe is me, right? So there's real fear there, worshipful fear. And then the third thing is that they may know that this house that I have built is in your name, that you're here, right? That God is at work in the temple. There's this idea that that they would know that there's a place where God and man can meet. And for them, it was a temple. For us, it's Christ. And I think this is so critical for us, Scott, and I'll stop talking soon, but I was working through this with my son this morning through a very brief kind of morning devotional time that we had before I left for work. Those of you that follow us, you know, my oldest is adopted. So I'm reading this and I'm saying this to him, buddy, we are the foreigners. I'm of European descent. You're of African descent. Neither one of us are Israelites. If Solomon was watching us today, watching this podcast, Solomon's looking at us like, hey, look, there's two Gentiles talking about Israel's Messiah. There's incredible things there. And so, yeah, even though this isn't a missions text as far as like, yeah, go and tell, right? It doesn't explicitly say that. We should have that same heart that foreigners would see through our lives. People that are outside of Christ, certainly people that are outside of our nation, should see something in our life worth inquiring about, should see the glory of God in our midst, just like the temple. We're the temple, right? They should see something worth asking about. We should have lives worth imitating, worth inquiring about. Then we should have that same heart for the foreigner that Solomon has as he decides to pray for foreigners, even in that moment that's all focused on the glorious things happening in that nation at that particular time. I just think that biblically we've got to deal with that. Yeah. Yes, the politics have to be thought through, but we've got to deal with God's biblical heart for all the nations. I'm sure you agree.
Yeah, I mean, how that gets worked out politically, I think there's room for differences of opinion on that. There's not room for difference of opinion about how God uses his people to call the people who aren't his people to Christ. You can trace that throughout the Bible. I mean, I'm preaching through Exodus, and it's just striking how God uses the plagues, and I shared with you something I wrote for our church folks about that from a sermon I preached in the middle of the plagues. Some of the Egyptians are fearing God. At the end, when God leads them out of the Exodus, we find, we have all these foreigners with us that need to be circumcised. Like, there were people that were fearing God and following God and doing that. In a few chapters later, or the book later in 2 Kings, you have Elijah, and he's interacting with the Syrians. And there's definitely displays of God's power to the Syrians that are redemptive, to call them to worship the one true God. But there's also like that danger too, because yes, we're talking about Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 8. Well, if we flip over three chapters, we get past the Queen of Sheba, what do we see? That there is that danger.
He did love his foreigners a little too much, is what you're saying.
I mean, there's that danger that his heart was drawn to foreign gods, and that becomes a persistent problem in Israel, right? That they still are drawn to that. Not, so it's not the cultural stuff; it's the faith that is pulled away. And so, I think it's really important that as Christians, like, we don't allow political voices on the left or the right to allow us to read the scriptures in a way that doesn't reflect God's heart. We should, policies matter. They do matter. There's some differences of opinions that are probably allowable for Christians on policy matters. But when it comes down to what God is saying about his heart for people who do not know him and desire for the nations to follow him, that's where Christians should be first. That's our first allegiance, is to the kingdom of God.
I think we're on the same wavelength here, because I just think, and you can tell me what your thoughts are on this. I do
Yeah.
think that one really clarifying concept here is the idea that we get from Augustine and others just throughout classical Christian history. This idea of ordering our loves rightly, ordering our affections rightly. When we recognize that God is a God that gives good gifts, and there's nothing wrong with loving and enjoying those gifts so long as they're all put in the proper priority. Obviously, our love for God is first and foremost, and the second greatest command is to love your neighbor as yourself, right? There is a right way to love your own country. There's a right way to love your own culture. There's a right way to love the national sovereignty of your nation. That has to be put in order. So does your love for all of the nations, because you know that you love God who loves all nations, and God who's bringing people of every nation, tribe, and tongue. And it's not loves in order as far as like a bullet pointed list, right?
Yeah.
Anything can potentially become idolatrous. But what we tend to do is we say, well, if it could be an idol, let's jettison that, right? Like, oh, if I could maybe idolize my marriage, well, then let's just forget to ever talk about marriage, right? And we forget, no, God has made us to live in the world, to have loyalties, to be situated in time and space and people groups and all those sorts of things. And that's a beautiful thing in the plan of God, so long as we are also doing that in light of the God who loves all of them. And one thing that we were talking about before we started to record is, who do you love? Who do you feel close to? Who do you feel fellowship with? I feel, and this is me personally, more fellowship with the Nigerian pastor that I was talking to a few weeks ago at a conference, who I had to teach him how to use whipped cream because he never used it from a spray can. I said, oh yeah, us Americans will put anything, cheese, pancakes, we'll put anything in an aerosol can, right? But I feel more fellowship with him, even though he's from a completely different cultural context, because we have Christ in common, than I feel like I have in common with my white suburban middle-class neighbor who may or may not vote the same way I do, but doesn't serve my God, is serving a completely different set of idols.
Well, I mean, I think there's a danger in Scripture. Go 4 more chapters down in First Kings, where you've got the separating of the kingdoms, and then you've got Jeroboam, who establishes false places of worship in Bethel and Dan, because he values his nationalism more than he's valuing the worship of the one true God. And we see how that just causes the people to continue to whore after other gods. And there's a real warning there, I think, of the danger of how putting certain allegiances over our allegiance to the worship of the true God can easily become compromises that a few years later, people living in Israel and the northern kingdom of Israel didn't even really ever think about the fact that they should have been worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem. They never even thought that this was disordered and wrong. And as a result, you have kings like Ahab completely turning a blind eye and then even promoting idolatrous worship in a way that just affected the whole nation. So I think that sometimes, I'm now making a big leap, God is allowing us as the church to deal with these opportunities that come into our path with nations that are on our doorstep that cause us to wrestle with how we're ordering our loves. I would say, like having the opportunity to have this family in our home it's inconvenient in some ways. It's stressful, not because they're bad people. They're incredibly sweet people. They're the best hostess I've ever had. She cooks amazing food. They're sweet. They go back to their room. They're quiet, but they need help. Communication's difficult. Just having someone who's not your family in your home is difficult. It takes more energy. Like our church is putting lots of money and energy into helping not just this family, but others. But what I'm also seeing in the community is how God is using that in ways that I just wouldn't have even necessarily thought of. Yeah. Fremont's a beautiful place because of the diversity, and we have the different Afghan markets. I've never gone into the Afghan markets. Why would I? There's nothing there that I need to buy. But we've got 2 or 3 nice size markets, and I'll be in there and they'll be talking in Dari and getting this and getting that and things I've never seen before. And gets to the end, and I don't know what this family's saying to the shopkeeper, but he stops and looks at me and says, "Thank you for what you're doing. This means a lot to me," even though these are strangers to him too. But the way we are showing love to them is actually they're seeing that difference. And then it's also setting up our friends who are very evangelistic. I mean, the story of how they came to Christ is just like, Tara and I were talking about, we feel like we're housing people of whom the world's not worthy. I mean, they've literally giving up everything to follow Jesus. They're putting their life on the line. But they became believers by they fled the Taliban the first time and ended up in Pakistan and became around Christians and heard the gospel for the first time. Then they were saved. Then they were discipled by a missionary working out of India, and then a Romanian missionary who speaks Dari, does precepts Bible teaching, and they've been discipled by precepts Bible teaching to a missionary that's Romanian that was learned. I mean, it's just incredible what God's done. Wow. And now we just get to be one more piece of that puzzle in a place that most people would not think is a hub of Afghan life here in Fremont, California, but it really is. And then our little act of saying, well, for now you can live with us while we're sorting out your permanent living situation, which I'm really thankful for ABWE. The amount of generosity that they're pouring on this family is just such a testimony to the world that says this isn't the way Americans typically act. And gives them actually an opportunity to proclaim the gospel in their own language in this place.
Wow. It's so true. I was looking at a statistic from the traveling team. They've got some good resources on their website. And one of them was, of the 450,000 international college students that are coming to the U.S. every single year, which the majority of them are from the 1040 window, 80% of them are never invited into an American home. So you're absolutely right. Americans typically aren't showing that level of hospitality to each other, much less somebody that's not from the United States. And I want to say, here's something that we're not saying, that I'm not saying, and then there's something also that challenges me here too. So I have a fence around my yard because I love my kids, not because I hate my neighbors, but because I love my kids. When you have something that you value, you protect it. Proverbs 25:28 says that a man without self-control is like a city without walls, right? That, in other words, you're broken down, you're defenseless, you can be taken advantage of. You wouldn't be showing hospitality to the Afghan family in your home if you didn't have a home, right? Or if you really just had a plot of grass in the middle of a park. And yet, at the same time, what really challenges me is when I look at how crazy we've gone in this country as a secular state that is completely drunk on the consequences of secularism, that we're in total chaos apart from Christ, because it is Christ or chaos. What amazes me is, what if, in the providence of God, what might change this culture and our particular nation towards being impacted by the gospel, towards conforming more to Christ and his kingdom, would be the influence of Nigerian Christians that come here, of Chinese believers that come here, of Afghan believers that come here as missionaries, for heaven's sake. I mean, what a cool thing. If you look at the history of the church is full of times in history where Christians haven't done a good job of missions, and so God has forced peoples and nations to intermingle and mix. After all, Acts 17 tells us that God is sovereign over the dwelling places and where one lives at a time and where another lives at another time. And yet, what if he was doing all of that so that we could be challenged and upbuilt and evangelized by our Christian brothers and sisters from parts of the world where they've had to sacrifice so much more? And it sounds like that sort of challenging effect and sharpening ironing is already happening in your own household, Scott.
Well, yeah. And when you're around new believers or believers that have been saved out of false religions, and you see their passion to see their countrymen and their neighbors know Jesus that way, it has a shaking effect on you. You know, I do think that we Americans can be very much prone to idolatry. We can make patriotism an idol. And I'm not against patriotism. I'm not non-patriotic, but it can become an idol. I think we can definitely make safety, security, freedom, all of those things can become idols. Good things can become idols. Usually it's good things that become idols, not bad things. It's good things wrongly ordered that can become idols in our life. And sometimes God uses these outside influences to shake us and make us aware of those things. And so I am very thankful. And then what's also happening too, with these people coming in, is like, we got this struggling little Afghan church here in Fremont that is faithfully reaching people. And the pastor and his wife, he's an Afghan believer. She was a former missionary, and they work so hard. I admire them so much. They're so hospitable. They have, I think, 8 or 9 people living in their home right now. It's incredible what they do. But being able to have disciple believers moving into their church just multiplies the work that they can do. It increases encourages them to be able to have 15 in church instead of 13, and most of those 13 aren't, don't really know the Lord yet, or they're just really young believers. To be able to have them there, and what that allows them to be able to do, and the impact that the greater impact they can have. So I'm thankful. I realized it was a bold move, I think, for ABWE, Every Ethne, and Live Global to take this step. But I want to say to pastors out there who are thinking about this, I mean, I'm very impressed with the level of screening that they've done. These believers are solid. And if you're thinking about, do I want to give to a program like this? Like, I think supporting these national believers working in partnership with local churches like mine, with oversight and accountability, and still probably living on poverty level wages, but to be able to help them to do their ministry better, I can't think of a better thing to do. If you want to see it better, I'd say come out to Fremont, come see what's happening on Sunday morning in our church, and then Sunday afternoon in the Afghan church. See how this is happening in real time. But I know this is a major emphasis of ABWE right now to raise support for this. I know our leaders have put their neck on the line to see this happen. And I'd love to give a standing ovation to them and say, thank you for doing this. And I want to encourage our listeners and our pastors and churches out there to consider getting behind this. You've probably got something in your mail, or you can go to the website. This is making a major impact, and it's only been going on for a couple months.
Yeah, you can learn more at abwe.org/Afghan. But as we close, I really think that we all need to channel our inner John Knox. John Knox's famous quote. You know the quote I'm thinking of, Scott? You know where I'm going with this?
I do not know, but if it's John Knox, I'm probably excited about it.
Knox had that great liner.
I love Knox blocks.
Lord, give me Scotland or I die. Right? That's the kind of nationalism that we need. Give me Afghanistan or I die. Give me Fremont or I die. Give me Harrisburg or I die, right? That we would offer up our lives to be used of the Lord for the discipling of the nations, both countries and the people groups within them. And then as we all follow Christ, we figure out what it means together to be interacting with brothers and sisters of every nation, tribe, and tongue, because we're going to spend eternity together someday, right? So we need that spirit of John Knox in our midst. And if you want to learn more about the Afghan Initiative, abwe.org/Afghan. And Scott, on behalf of everyone listening, can I just kind of channel probably some of the feeling and thank you and celebrate the ministry and the sacrifice that you and your family have right now in this season to care for this Christian Afghan believing family. It's a really cool thing.
I feel silly calling it anything like a sacrifice, because even calling it an
hospitality, Scott, is always a sacrifice. Whoever gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in my name will by no means lose his reward. Keep that in mind. So great is your reward, my friend. And great is your reward for watching and listening to the Missions Podcast today. Thank you for joining us. We're glad you did. This is a ministry of ABWE. To learn more, go to abwe.org. You can get more content at missionspodcast.com. One way that you can bless this ministry is by supporting it at missionspodcast.com/support. Hey, we've got a pretty studio here. There's some things that we need to do. Your support, if the Lord would lay that on your heart, would really help us out. But you can also support the show in other ways by sharing the show, rating it positively, giving it a positive review. That will help favor it in the algorithms, and other people will discover the content and be blessed by it. Thanks again for joining us, and until our next episode, thanks for watching and listening. Bye-bye.